Please introduce yourself, and you may begin.
Merci, Madame la Secrétaire. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairperson, Commissioners, and Commission staff. Before I start the presentation, I'll introduce myself and my colleagues. I'm Jean-François Dumoulin. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory and Government Affairs. To my left is Samer Bichet, our CEO and founder. To his left, Cameron Zumko, our COO for ICE Wireless. And to the far left, Shaker Vassal, our Senior Vice President of Strategy, Marketing, and Customer Experience. And to my right is François Picard, our Vice President of Wireless Networks. So our presentation today will start with a brief introduction of ICE Wireless, Iristel, and Sugar Mobile. And then we'll move on to discuss why we're in favor of a regulatory regime that mandates access to the national incumbents networks for full MVNOs. We will discuss some of the MVNO models that were proposed by other interveners and why we do not think these models are the best solution. And lastly, I will make brief comments on why we believe that mandating MVNO access will not harm investments in facilities-based networks. Now I'm going to turn it over to Samer to do a quick introduction.
Thank you for the
You're welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on such an important matter. Iristel is Canada's largest competitive local exchange carrier. ICE Wireless is a mobile network operator that was founded in Inuvik in Northwest Territories in 1999, and Sugar Mobile is a Wi-Fi first mobile service. Before anything else, I'd like to step back to the CRTC's landmark ruling in 2016, declaring high-speed broadband internet a basic service. That decision was forward-thinking and essential to Canadians and our economy. And in real and important sense, it has a lot to do with the hearing today. But before I link the two, let me say a few words about the Iristel group of companies. Iristel began in 1999, shortly after I graduated from York University's Space and Communications Science program in Toronto in '98. I got a job at the Canadian Space Agency in Montreal with the dream of becoming an astronaut. Then in Montreal, I came across the Science Journal talking about a hot new technology called VoIP, something that would revolutionize the telecom industry. I was fascinated and hooked. Entrepreneurial excitement pushed aside my celestial cravings. I didn't know much about telecom back then, but I love technology and what it can do to improve our lives. Before long, and in my Montreal apartment, I built and tested a bona fide VoIP system using IBM servers worth an astronomical $120,000 back in 1999. I was in deep, and I was only 22 years old. But then I discovered regulatory barriers preventing me from starting a competitive VoIP service here in Canada. So I looked elsewhere and landed my first contract in Côte d'Ivoire on Africa's west coast. Telecom knows no boundaries, and we proved that by serving countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Those early days were difficult, but we persevered. We made mistakes, we took risks, we got caught in a civil war, we almost got killed in a terrorist attack. Thankfully, regulatory barriers came down, and we came to Canada. Today, as I said, Iristel is Canada's largest CLEC network, supporting around 7 million phone numbers in every province and territory. When the CRTC opened Canada's North to telecom competition in December 2011, Iristel was the first CLEC there, helping bridge the digital divide. We are still the only CLEC with a network that reaches coast to coast to coast, from the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Arctic Oceans, with more than 2,700 rate centers on our wireline network. By comparison, there are roughly 2,400 rate centers on Bell's wireline network, 1,200 on TELUS's wireline network, and 500 on Rogers. Iristel's IP-based VoIP network is used as the underlying carrier by hundreds of telecom service providers, large and small. We provide more than half of all the phone numbers purchased through wholesale in Canada. More recently, Iristel has made some major investments in wireless by acquiring a PCS spectrum license in eastern Quebec, and last year we acquired a spectrum license for Newfoundland and Labrador. We are in the process of building our wireless network in eastern Quebec, and Newfoundland will follow. And Iristel continues to operate internationally through Lte Romania as a fully licensed CLEC since 2003, Iristel Norway as an Mvno through Spectrum we recently acquired, and Iristel Kenya as an Mvno. Ice Wireless was the first mobile wireless operator in Inuvik and several other communities in the Northwest Territories. Today, our network has grown to a point where we cover over half the population of the 3 territories and Nunavut and Arctic Quebec. We were the first mobile wireless operator to offer unlimited data plans to Canadians over 1 year before the incumbents launched the first such plan in southern Canada, unless you account the pre-City Fido days, which were pre-Rogers days, of course. I do remember a City or a Fido unlimited data plan. And when Bell's Northwestel said 3G service wasn't economically feasible in Iqaluit, Ice Wireless proved it could be. Funny, but several months after Ice Wireless launched 3G in Iqaluit, Northwestel did so too. The same thing happened in Inuvik. Competition has been good for underserved communities in the north, and we know how to reach underserved communities. Now, we want to serve more Canadians, especially those economically disadvantaged and who simply cannot afford to get on wireless networks. We have always considered ourselves to be a consumer-focused organization, and our mission is to bring value to our customers in innovative ways that do not break their pockets. In 2015, we launched a low-cost Wi-Fi mobile wireless service, Sugar Mobile. Sugar Mobile offered plans at $19 per month at cost-conscious consumers. As you probably know, the Sugar Mobile saga set off a sequence of events that led to the minister requesting a reconsideration of a commission decision, indirectly leading to mandated low-cost, data-only plans, and potentially to this review being moved up by 1 year. And while Sugar Mobile has been on hold since 2016, we will be relaunching it this year in partnership with Text Plus, a Wi-Fi first app-based VoIP service that already has over 100 million global installs and over 400,000 active users in Canada, and millions in the US. The new Sugar Mobile is an ad-based application that allows customers to either earn credits by watching advertisements or to buy credits if they don't want to watch ads. This service supports inbound and outbound calls and SMS. We believe that it will provide a very low-cost alternative to traditional mobile service for very cost-conscious consumers. For our users of more traditional mobile wireless service, who may also be very cost-conscious, we announced last week that our Ice Wireless will launch new plans that are billed weekly, starting at 99 cents per week for a 50-minute voice plan. We believe that this is another first for the wireless industry in Canada and will address some of the needs we see in the far north, where cost of living is very high, and for some households, every dollar counts. I'd like to go back to my opening statement about the CRTC's bold declaration that broadband and mobile wireless service is now a basic service, just like dial tone. But high wireless prices effectively change the CRTC's universal basic service promise to far too many. If low-income Canadians cannot afford to get on the Rogers, Bell, and TELUS wireless networks, then your ruling means broadband is a universal right, but only on a landline or Wi-Fi. I do not for one moment believe that was your intention when you took that step in 2016. As things stand, we've failed Canadians when it comes to basic wireless service. We agree with Elliot Noss from Two Cows, who told you last week that access to wireless networks should be like access to water and sewage systems, the power grid, and more. It's infrastructure. It's 2020, and the big three have been rewarded plenty over the past 35 years for investing in this infrastructure. Record high wireless rates, tax write-offs, even government subsidies. It's time for Canadians, not just Rogers, Bell, and TELUS shareholders, to share in the benefits. Before closing, I'd like to say that I don't envy you, the commissioners, but participants of all views in this proceeding seem to have no trouble finding experts and research that corroborates precisely the position that happens to serve their best interest. You are now left with the task of separating fact from fiction. First, who can predict the future so clearly? Second, we've seen their movie many times before. They're gunslingers for hire. The big three's Chicken Little arguments in 2020 echo what your esteemed predecessors heard all the way back in 1992, when the CRTC opened up Canadian long-distance service to competition. The sky didn't fall after the landmark 9212 decision, and it won't fall after this one. Should you mandate fair and equitable access to wireless infrastructure, coupled with extraordinary technological advancements, telecom competition, real competition, creates untold benefits for Canadians, especially those at the lower economic end. As you yourselves say, broadband access is a basic universal right for Canadians as we move further into the 21st century. We may not know the future, but Canadians know what they don't want. They don't want the status quo. Now I'd like to hand it over to Jean-François.
Thank you, Samar. I want to address some of the issues that have been raised in this proceeding. So we've heard a wide range of arguments and proposed models for MVNOs. And for our part, I guess it's no secret that we favor regulation that mandates MVNO access to the national incumbents networks. The Commissioner of Competition submitted, as part of this proceeding, a report that concludes that the incumbents have market power, they act in a coordinated manner, and prices for wireless services in Canada are higher than those in other jurisdictions. And we agree with these conclusions. CNOC, in its presentation, cited the Rewheel report that was published in the fall of 2019 that shows that while prices have dropped slightly in the last year, Canada continues to fall behind the rest of the world in terms of wireless affordability. This is research, this research, both from CNOC and from the Commissioner of Competition, is from parties that do not have a direct financial interest in the outcome of these proceedings. This research shows that the current course of action isn't working to bring affordable mobile wireless services to Canadians. We believe that the Commission should allow wholesale access to the incumbents' wireless network, the national incumbents, which is consistent with the Commission's wholesale policy for broadband access. This access should be open to full MVNOs, those companies that own a network core, that operate their own billing, sales, and distribution channels, and who have the option of negotiating their own roaming agreements. And these MVNOs should be allowed to resell to other resellers, as is currently the case with wholesale broadband. And we don't believe that this mandated access should be restricted to facilities-based MNOs or other facilities-based network operators, although we're not opposed to any additional measure that the Commission might propose to promote investment in facilities-based mobile wireless networks, especially in underserved or unserved regions. I referenced the Commissioner of Competition's report, and while we agree with these findings, we think that the recommendations miss the mark and will not change the current situation for consumers. Consider that the MVNO regime proposed by the Commissioner will not allow any new players to enter the wireless market. It will allow regional providers, like ourselves, to develop markets a little bit faster than with no MVNO regime, but only marginally, and potentially with penalties that may serve as a credible disincentive to use the regime. It's difficult to believe that the same players doing the same things will somehow lead to different and better outcomes for consumers. The Commissioner and his staff stated that a facilities-based solution was the best solution. We disagree. And in any case, the definition of facility seems to be evolving. Last year, for example, Minister Bain stated that he believed that software could be included in what constitutes facilities. And I guess we look forward to seeing whether, subsequent to the broadcast and telecom legislative review, that definition will change in the legislation. Iristel is in a unique situation in Canada as a company that is both heavily invested in services-based competition and that has made substantial investment in facilities-based mobile wireless network. And I believe we're the only regional MNO on this record that is advocating for full MVNO access. We use revenue from service-based solutions as a source of capital to fund our expenditures related to wireless network build-outs. And we well understand the government's concern with maintaining an acceptable level of investment in facilities-based networks. In our case, if we were able to launch a national MVNO, some of those revenues would go to expanding our networks in the Arctic, in eastern Quebec, and in Newfoundland, where more facilities-based networks are needed. And while we don't agree with the Commissioner of Competition's MVNO recommendation, in the event that the Commission chooses this model, Iristel recommends that this regime be modified. First, facilities-based regional operators mobile network operators specifically, should be allowed to operate beyond the limit of their spectrum area in return for making facilities-based wireless network investments where they don't have spectrum. Secondly, a hard 5-year limit is not practical, considering it takes decades to build a high-quality wireless network. The Commission should instead leave the time frame open-ended and review the effects of the regime at regular intervals. In addition to the modifications I've just mentioned, we also support the proposal made by other participants to expand the current mandated wireless wholesale regime to include seamless roaming, and we also agree with ExploreNet's assessment that the roaming rates should be more in the $3 to $5 per gigabit range. In fact, actually, we believe that based on retail rates, it should be $2.50, no more. We also heard in this proceeding a suggested hybrid mobile network operator model from Cogeco. In the HMNO model, broadband network operators would have mandated wholesale access to the Big Three's networks and be allowed to operate as MVNOs in areas where they already provide broadband service, subject to maintaining a certain level of investment in their facilities-based networks. Unfortunately, this model is too restrictive. While we don't object to a requirement to maintain investment in our facilities-based network, consider that ICE Wireless provides broadband services through its mobile network. So allowing ICE Wireless to be an MVNO where it's already an MVNO brings nothing to the table. This model would only introduce a few new players in very limited areas and would leave out consumers who don't live in those areas. Lastly, I would like to address the objection that's been put forward by the incumbents and other regional MNOs that mandating access for full MVNO will harm investments made by facilities-based MNOs. Well, we are a facilities-based MNO, and we don't intend to slow our network build plans based on the outcome of this proceeding. Mobile network operators across the world continue to earn healthy profits and invest in their networks, even in areas where an MVNO market is thriving. There's absolutely no reason to think it will not be the same in Canada. What the Big Three and their executives fear is not loss of profit, it's loss of control. And as Samer said, the status quo is not acceptable. Thank you sincerely for giving us this opportunity to be heard, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Commissioner Leisner.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation and your comments. You've mentioned in your presentation that you don't think that mandating MVNOs would limit investments. We heard from Mr. Denton and Mr. Gamble just before you for the Internet Society that because MNOs would recover their costs through a costed approach plus a reasonable markup in their view, that again, in their view, that investments wouldn't be negatively affected by mandating MVNOs. I'm just wondering if we were to mandate MVNOs in your serving area, would that change your investment plans over the next 5 years? You've indicated that you have plans to invest, but would that make an additional change?
Absolutely not. It would actually accelerate it, and we've proven that model quite well in the CLEC side, on the wireline side. Sometimes when people ask me what does Iristel do that are not from the industry, I say, well, we're a platform company. The facility side of it is just a means to an end. It's not the end-all, be-all, and how we revolutionized how industry interacts with the boring side, which are the facility switches, fibers, and be able to provision, activate, and remarket the product to, because we have wholesalers that also resell to other wholesalers, and the reason why we're so successful is because of all the platform and innovation that we built around this boring infrastructure that allows us to accelerate and grow and grab more than 50% of the market share on the wireline side on wholesale. So absolutely not. We would actually, it would help us accelerate, and it was proven with the Sugar Mobile model as well, because we were taking some of that money to actually help build some of the facilities in Arctic Canada, which nobody else wants to build in other, unless they get a government subsidy or a grant or something.
Thank you. I was very interested to hear of some of the innovative retail offerings that you mentioned in your presentation just now. And I'm just wondering, do you offer prepaid plans in your serving area? or are they generally postpaid?
We offer both. A lot of the unfortunately, up in the north, one of the things that we discovered as we launched services there, a lot of people do not even have like a credit score or even in the system. So it was more of catering to a multitude of people up there that we just wouldn't have been able to service. So absolutely, we do both postpaid and prepaid.
So to what extent are customers denied access to postpaid plans on the basis of a credit rating?
Maybe that's,
You could.
yeah.
I think like any mobile carrier, we have a credit matrix, and we would refer to a credit matrix whenever we bring on a new customer. So I don't think we could speak exactly without really going into that.
Could you, by way of undertaking, provide more specifics to us and filed on a confidential basis if you require?
Yes, we could do that.
Thank you. In your view, do you think the Commission should be taking any steps to ensure that low-cost or occasional use plans are available on either a prepaid or a postpaid basis?
To mandate it, you mean, to the incumbents, or?
Right, as opposed to just letting the market take care of that.
So the situation we're in now, I think, requires regulatory oversight. We've missed the mark in a sense of allowing the free market economies take place because of I'm going to call it Canadian telecom incumbent greed that has overtaken what the situation we're in. So to do it any other way is not going to happen, right? I mean, there's no honor among thieves, and if you rely on honor to dictate what's going to happen, it's not going to happen. So we need the regulatory oversight, and that should apply actually across the board, whether we're regional or national. Keep us honest.
When we talk to Bell and tell us about the lower cost data-only plans that were introduced into the market following our decision in 2015 or 2018, they indicated that they didn't really see much demand for these lower cost data-only plans. In their view, consumers want much higher data requirements than the plans offered. And I'd like to know what your perspective is on the need for data-only plans.
I think they're important to have, especially with the advent of all the over-the-top applications. A lot of lower-income households or students in general do not actually have a traditional phone, even on a wireless. And so the newer generation, I'm finding more and more that they're more reliant on a data, and they use an app like a WhatsApp or a messenger on Facebook, and that's how they communicate. The result of what they, conceived as a low-cost data-only plan, to me, is more like a low-data, high-cost plan that ended up happening, right? Because
of the charges for overage.
Correct.
And how do you handle data overage charges in your offerings?
We have the maximum we've ever charged was $20 a gig, and that's on our website. And I believe most of our plans are actually at $10. And Shaker, maybe you want to confirm that. I'm not too sure.
That's a charge for overage, or that's your charge for a per gigabyte plan?
No, that's the overage.
That's the overage.
That's the overage. And these are regions that are running, in some cases, on satellite bandwidth, which in a place like Iqaluit, where we operate, it's a satellite only, and we do not differentiate between Iqaluit or Whitehorse or Yukon, where we have, Whitehorse or Yellowknife, where we actually have access to fiber. So we try to unify the plans because we're a big believer that there should be no difference or segregation between a Northern Canadian and a Southern one, and on top of that, a satellite-based community which actually needs data the most versus others.
But some would say that that's a very high price to pay for data overage. Do you have unlimited data plans?
We do. We do. They are, so just to kind of put it in perspective, when we are trying to unify a plan, so we have the unlimited, we do have the unlimited plans, and once again, it applies across the board, whether it's satellite community or not.
And what would be the price range of the unlimited plan?
Is it 69 or?
$69.
69.
And then once that, do you have any kind of throttling or anything, or is it just purely unlimited data?
Yeah, so we've introduced throttling on our satellite communities. We have not done so in our non-satellite communities. We tend to just monitor a report and see if we need to notify a customer if they're outside of their reasonable usage policy or anything like that. But we haven't enforced anything.
What kind of take-up do you get on those plans?
Quite a bit. So we launched an unlimited plan a year ago that wasn't throttling at all, and that was at $89. And then what happened was when the incumbent in our serving areas launched their plan, we said, okay, well, you know, a lot of people, this is kind of where I find that it's sometimes misleading when you call it unlimited, and people aren't really educated in terms of, okay, what's unlimited 20 or unlimited 15? And it's very misleading. So we found that a lot of our customers were actually switching because the plan was a little bit cheaper from Bell in some of these communities. So we've decided to try to balance it out and at least give something comparable. And I'm not sure if we still offer the 89 unlimited as well that has no throttling.
No, that's been discontinued.
That's been discontinued. Okay. So, so just to kind of put in perspective, we find that the unlimited plans are not really unlimited. And this is very misleading to the consumer. And we actually had to redact some of our offering in order to balance it out because we didn't want to lose market share.
So do you still offer the $69 plan with throttling?
Correct. We don't enforce the throttling in non-satellite, but yes.
Okay.
That's, yeah.
Okay. And do you have any plans to change that business model with respect to data overage charges, or you're just continuing with the current plans that you have?
We have plans that would that you could incur. Like, I mean, we give the choice to the consumer if you want to just buy up front like a 20 gig or something. Do we plan on changing? We're always changing. Otherwise, we would be obsolete. So, and the beauty about our platform that we developed that we are building on from the wireline side is the flexibility to be able to create these plans and even self-serve a lot of the changes. One of the things that maybe I could point to is when we ran a survey about a year ago, I think, the number one challenge that Canadians found, or that we found from the survey that they encountered as to why Canadians do not switch is because when they call into the customer service line of the incumbents, it takes them hours to try to get the information to do like a wireless port or to extract the information needed to give to the new carrier. And a lot of people just don't have the time to sit there. And what ends up happening is when you call into the incumbent's hotline, the customer service, once they know you're canceling, they're switching you from one operator to another to try to retain you. And that process is just not feasible for a lot of busy people that, you know, whether it's a student that has to go to a class or whatever it might be, or their moms that are paying their phone bill to actually sit there on the phone holding forever. So that was one of the things that we've tried to learn from and actually implement a platform that is completely self-serve, and we're evolving constantly.
Yes, and I think we heard that comment earlier today as well from PIAC, and we certainly heard it in our previous hearing on misleading and aggressive sales practices. Now, in those circumstances where customers do change, Have you had any challenges with respect to win-backs?
Probably not the right guy for that. Shaker, yeah.
Yeah, win-backs can become a challenge, and win-back, assuming you're referring to the incumbent keeping the customer that they have, right?
Correct.
Yes, we do have a challenge there. So if customers called in to get their information to try to cancel and they're offered something very aggressive and they tend to stay, then it makes it hard for us as well, right? We've got to, like the big players, we've also got to watch our cost of acquisition. So how much effort do we maintain to try to continue to get that customer over when they've been offered a plan? Maybe we put that effort into acquiring some other customers that are unhappy with the service of their service provider.
And what about if your customer wishes to change service providers? Do you engage in win-back offers?
Yeah, I think if I kind of go back to what Samer was saying earlier, I mean, we look at ourselves as a platform, right? A platform to enable. As a service provider of 7 million phone numbers in Canada, one of the reasons our wholesale customers come to us is because we allow the ability for them to move and to grow their business. So that same philosophy is what we bring to our retail customers as well, right? Our approach is not to try to punish our customers for leaving us. I mean, we want them to stay with us because they're happy.
Do you believe that there should be some constraints put on win-backs?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. Exactly how you would enforce those, I don't know. I mean, if a customer is calling in to get their information to go, do you enforce that win-backs are simply not allowed? I mean, if I look at it from our perspective, we would want.
Some parties have appeared before us and suggested that there should be a 90-day period, for example, where a company cannot engage in a win-back offer with a former customer. Do you support that, or do you?
You know what? I'd have to take that one away, and we can come back with some
so
guidance on
you
that.
undertake to give us your
You
position.
can take that, yeah.
Turn off the mic. Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. If 90 days seems like a way, in a way, if it was honest, it seems to be penalizing the Canadian consumer, to be, just to be quite frank. The problem is, and the challenge is, the incumbents are really smart at what they do, and they have, compared to, let's say, one guy on our side working to fix a problem, they've got 20 guys to do the same thing. And the issue here is, if there was a way or a mechanism to make sure that the plan that they're going to offer that Canadian consumer was already posted, and it's not something specific to try to hurt the other operator. So we've seen like all the feud that's happening between Videotron and Bell. If
Right.
Bell knew that it was a Videotron customer, they will probably come up with a new plan that nobody has heard of and not publicized to offer to that consumer. That should not be allowed. But to put a time limit seems to me like we're just punishing the customer, even though we would be at the disadvantage, because, I mean, I know the incumbents would love to win back all the customers, but I just feel like we need to be a little bit more open and transparent and say, you know what, the customer has a choice, but if that's the plan, then it better be advertised somewhere, and it's not something that they pull out, like a rabbit out of the hat last minute to try to save that customer because of another competitor.
So do you engage in what some might say would be a proactive measure to ensure that your longtime customer has a plan tailored to their needs in the form of a win-back that's not part of a posted plan?
I guess, and Samer or Cameron will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't believe that we will offer plans to customers that are not already in our profile and that aren't already advertised.
Okay. Do you have a view on whether the Commission should either impose a condition of service or reassert its powers of rate regulation over the retail market with respect to the provision of a low-cost or occasional use plan below a certain price point, either because competition is not providing those plans or that it's necessary for vulnerable low-income subscribers?
I don't think the Commission should intervene with any type of retail offering. I think having more competition in general, whether it's through MVNOs or other MNOs, will naturally dictate that price, and let the best man win. Basically, that's how it should be. Starting to play with retail rates, in my opinion, would be an overly it'll be a huge burden on the Commission to try to monitor and continuously police such activity, especially when we're talking about 5G, when the whole evolution about 5G is about rapid deployment, speed, agility, response. Like it just seems to be counterproductive if we went down that path.
Some interveners in their filings on the record, and some that have appeared before us, have talked about the lack of transparency of a lower cost option, that when they go into a kiosk, they're immediately upsold. When they're online, they don't see any visibility for low cost plans. So do you think it would be important for the Commission to impose some conditions under Section 24 that relate to making such plans more transparent so that consumers are aware of their existence in a clearer fashion?
I think it's very important, and I think it relates to my point earlier to the unlimited plan itself today is very misleading. And I believe there was an issue down south in the U.S. Where AT&T was actually throttling on an unlimited plan. And if I'm not mistaken, they actually lost that, and they are only throttling now upon congestion of their network. And that's a fair way to, market an unlimited plan. To me, an unlimited plan today, and what we have in Canada, is not really unlimited. Yeah.
So you would say that where there's throttling in terms of unlimited plans, as well as where there's a lack of visibility of low-cost plans, that it would be important to ensure that carriers make all those plans very clear, so that the consumer knows exactly what they're getting into.
Agreed. I mean, if you just look, if you just step back and you just look at some of the surveys as to what people, like if you ask just the normal person off the street, Kudo, they're going to think it's their own independent company, or Virgin, or Chatter. So the average person doesn't know. And I can assure you that if it was my parents going to buy a plan and they saw unlimited, they would think it's unlimited. They would not know any better, right? And that's just the nature of the beast, the environment that we live in.
I'd like to ask you a few questions now on your vision of a mandated MVNO. What do you think the entry would look like? For example, how many new providers do you think might enter the market? How much market share might they collect over what time period? Do you have any thoughts on that to share with us?
Sure. I mean, I have very high-level thoughts. I don't think we should codify anything in terms of a quantity, or, when the mandate was, let's get a fourth national operator in Canada. I think these types of statements set us up for failure. If we look at the Internet, and the reason why the Internet has become what it is today is, it's divided up in layers. So you have 7 layers. The last layer is the application layer. The first layer is the physical layer. And the applications that were developed are the ones that are driving all the data usage that we are in today. So all the social media, all the Netflixes. So to say that the Internet would have been built by facilities-based providers and not by the application providers, I think would be incorrect. And we've seen it. The history book has been written for us already, and it seems like we're falling into a trap just because of certain individuals or incumbents are trying to give us a song and dance that just doesn't make sense. We've seen it before, and the reason why we're actually here today is because of the high data usage that has been introduced by applications like Netflix or Uber. I mean, Uber is not even a facilities-based operation, but they're very successful because they've focused on one thing, and it's an application.
Right, but under your model, what do you think the entry would look like? How many MVNOs would want to get into the market, over what time frame?
Yeah, so in our model, we want to open it up for everybody, okay? And let market power dictate who succeeds, who doesn't. Because we're good at wholesaling and we've developed these platforms, we actually see ourselves as an MVNE enabling other MVNOs, because not every MVNO would be interested in negotiating interconnects with the incumbents, doing local number portability, AS2 interconnections. All that stuff takes years, right? These guys are good at marketing. They are good at an application layer that targets a demographic, and we could enable that for them. So if they want to go build their own platform, great. If we could do it for them, great. It would just add on another layer for our wireline network that's already in place.
Yeah. Should we be, oh, somebody wanted to add to that?
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Samer was saying, that I'm not sure, Commissioner Leisner, if your concern is about the possible high number of MVNOs that would enter the market, but I just wanted to add to Samer's comments that MVNOs are in effect operators, and they don't have the RAN and the backhaul, but they have everything else, assuming that what you would adopt as a regime is full MVNO. And this is fairly complex, and it's not going to be necessarily accessible to everybody. So Samer was, sorry, go ahead.
Some interveners that appeared before us this week suggested that at most an MVNO market share would be about 10%. Well, do you have any view on that?
So we haven't run any numbers or done any studies to look at what a national market share would be like. We have some general ideas in terms from our own historical experiences with Sugar Mobile, what we think we could do, but we don't have studies. Certainly, if we compare the wireline or wireless broadband markets, where I believe the recent report from the Competition Bureau said they had 13% of the market in broadband, I think it would be fair to assume that you would get similar numbers in market share in MVNOs, which is above that 5.5% threshold that Dr. Chipti identified in the Matrix report. So there is a potential there, even though we're not talking about a potentially huge disruption of the wireless market, but maybe a significant enough disruption that it will discipline pricing and stimulate innovation.
And what about the concerns? I'll let you answer in a second. I'll just put this other question out. What about the concerns that have been expressed that the market will be flooded, there'll be fly-by-night operators, they'll collect some customers, their business model won't work, they'll go out of business, customers will be left in the lurch? Is that a real concern?
No, that's never a concern. We've seen this happen in the wireline side, and customers just get gobbled up by another provider, or they switch providers. As long as there's ample notice, typically that's never an issue. Just to go back on the previous point, if I can add one thing, just from a historical perspective and a living proof, when Iristel started, we actually were not a CLEC in Canada. We were reselling. At the time, it was Group Telecom, and we were acquiring PRI lines and building that network. And naturally, the revenue that we generated actually helped us build the network facility so that we become the CLEC Type 1 underlying carrier that serves other CLECs today as well. So from a market perspective, just to answer that specific question, the percentages, so if we look at that from a retail, Iristel has less than 10%, maybe less than 5% retail presence in Canada. But from a wholesale, we're over 50%. But we started from zero from both sides.
In terms of geographic market, if we were to mandate service on a regional level rather than a national level, say at the provincial level or census metropolitan area level, would that reduce the likelihood of entry by you?
Yeah, definitely. Telecom knows no boundaries, and to start putting, in a way, artificial boundaries or geopolitical type boundaries is not a way to build a network. Canadians want, you want peace of mind. You want to be able to go to your mom's house that lives in Quebec, go to your dad's that maybe has moved to Saskatchewan, whatever it might be, and get the same level of service without having to deal with a lot of these nuances that a just consumer can't be bothered with. And especially in a workforce today that's mobile, that almost seems counterintuitive as well.
And you mentioned some of the services that you've started, the ad-based service, weekly plans at 99 cents a week, low-cost Wi-Fi that you mentioned this morning. Do you think that in that vein, it's fair to say that MVNOs would offer more competitive service than flanker brands?
Absolutely. I mean, MVNOs or just other competition will provide a completely different vantage point into the whole problem that we're encountering today. And the flanker brands are really, in most cases, they're actually more expensive if you are going in overages, and I actually don't see a value. I've looked at them. Maybe I'm missing something. If you want to add something, JF, but we need innovation.
And I'm thinking that, Bell and TELUS, who are before us, and I'm sure Rogers will likely as well, say that we have flanker brands. They're operating to address other areas of the market that are underserved. But how do you respond to that? Do you have anything else to add?
Well, I think it's very important. The key issue with flanker brands versus an independent MVNO is the degree of control over which the parent exercises over the flanker brand. And this is one of the reasons why we're advocating for full MVNO as opposed to a branded resale model. So you want your MVNO to have as much independence as possible from the host MNO and to be able to choose which host MNO and to have their own numbering resource and to have the ability to negotiate their own roaming agreements, use their own core and so forth, to really be as independent as possible in order to have the ability to innovate. If you have a flanker brand that is effectively just a vassal of the parent, you're not going to get that innovation, and so you're not going to get and you may not get the increased efficiency either, because it's effectively just a rebrand. And so by being just a rebrand, you're not really getting to the core of the issue, which is the pricing. If you have a full MVNO that is independent as opposed to a flanker brand, then that MVNO can start to perhaps discipline price, to innovate, to come up with new ideas that perhaps the parent company because they do things in a certain way, perhaps wouldn't have done. And those are the sorts of things that we were able to do in the voice market, and that we see that are potentially possible in the MVNO market. I mean, when Iristel started or even going before that, when deregulation started to happen in both long distance and local voice markets, I don't think anybody came to the table and said, if we do this, we'll do it because in 10 years, we're going to have this cool application that lets you use the PSTN directly from your computer. But that's what it led to.
Right.
And nobody knows what's going to happen in 5 years. But if we kind of stay in the status quo, we'll never get there. We'll never see it. Or they'll get there in the US or they'll get there in Europe, and we're going to be trailing along trying to catch up.
Yeah, if I can just top up on that. Even in introducing the 99-cent weekly plan, which will launch soon, as well as additional low-cost weekly plans that we will be introducing. We did survey the market and look at what's available, both from the main brands as well as the flanker brands in the ICE wireless territory, and we didn't see anything which was filling the need of some of these low-cost plans that we will be introducing, right? And the flanker brands have been in market a long time, but when we did the comparison of their pricing compared to what the mothership was offering, in many cases it wasn't different, and that's what allowed us to put together some what I feel will be very competitive plans that come into market. And also, when we're just, looking to what we're introducing in the market, we're obviously looking at what we feel our consumers need, and that's why we are investing in things like Sugar Mobile, investing in OTT companies such as Text Plus, so that we have all the tools to put together solutions for customers to consume services differently. So going back to your question earlier about data only, yeah, a lot of customers are starting to disaggregate their voice from data. So we're looking to say, how do we put it all together so customers can pick and choose how they actually consume service?
We've heard from some consumer groups about markets that they consider to be particularly underserved. Are there any markets that you consider to be particularly underserved that would require the Commission to intervene?
If you drive north of Toronto by like 2-3 hours, there's a lot of underserved communities just north of Huntsville, but pretty much. So yes, there's definitely a lot of communities. There's a lot of places where there's still no mobile service in Canada. There's a lot of places that we're the only mobile operator in the country. Whether it be government subsidies or just allowing competition to flourish, putting aside wireline versus wireless, then we can use some of the money we generate to invest in some of these regions. And that's why, back to the point, it has to be nationally done.
If we look at the Bureau's proposed model, which I believe you suggested in your January 2020 submission at paragraph 3, that it would not result in any meaningful benefit to the Canadian consumer. Can you expand on that and what you meant by meaningful benefit?
Well, and I alluded to it a little bit in the statement, in the opening statement. The commissioners, the report identified a whole bunch of problems, from market power and pricing issues and so forth. And then the recommendations are, it's just a very minor nudge. Like, it's really, if you look at, for example, a regional provider, and I'm saying this as one of the MNOs in Canada that probably could benefit the most from that particular regime, because we're still building networks in places, and we have spectrum in places where we haven't started building. But in more mature markets where you have regional operators that have been there for a long time, they're building in the incentive that the commissioner's report or regime would give them would be to launch to market in the periphery of their network. So they've already got the core. So, Freedom's already in Toronto and Videotron's already in Montreal. And so what can they go grab as an MVNO? Well, they can go grab the areas where they haven't built out yet. But those are very, they're very wide, kind of right at the edge of their network. So they might be able to launch to market in those areas a little bit sooner. But that's all that's going to happen. It doesn't introduce any new players into the market. It'll introduce a new player a little bit sooner in that market. And it doesn't, it just doesn't move the needle. You know, you're talking about essentially doing more or less the same thing as you would otherwise. And as you know, as we've been talking a lot about 5G and this kind of whole big specter of 5G that's looming in these upcoming investments. Well, if I'm one of these kind of larger regional players and I'm looking at my capital investment budget for the next 5 years, and the big three are coming behind me with 5G in these urban markets that are my bread and butter, where do I want to put my capital? Do I want to build out my towers in the real periphery of my network so that I can fulfill the obligations before I lose my Mvno, or do I want to start putting 5G in my dense urban markets? And if I was in their shoes, I know how I'd answer.
I totally agree. This is, I mean, this relates to the barrier to entry that constitutes spectrum. I mean, these, applying the Competitions Bureau recommendation would only allow those regional players to deploy in areas where they already have spectrum. Otherwise, the risk would be too great because they could face penalties if they haven't caught up within 5 years. And if they don't have any spectrum in an area that they launch an MVNO service, then, I mean, tough luck, they're screwed.
And recognizing that this is not a model that you're in favor of, do you think you would qualify as a disruptor under the Bureau's model?
Well, we're definitely, yeah, I mean, we've definitely proven it already multiple times here that we've disrupted the industry. But yeah, we completely do not see eye to eye with the Bureau on their findings.
Okay. If we adopted the Bureau's model or a variation of it, would it be appropriate to restrict the MVNO access to regional carriers with a minimum number of subscribers, let's say 10,000 or 15,000 subscribers?
Well, no, because if you are building out, you presumably in a particular area, you may not have a lot of subscribers. Or for example, in our case, we have spectrum that we just acquired in the 600 megahertz auction in Newfoundland. Presumably, the Competition model, Bureau's model would allow us to start as an MVNO there and then build our network in the areas where we're serving population, but we, right now we have no users because we have no network. So certainly we're not in favor of any minimum threshold. I think, if you do want to adopt the Competition Bureau's model, and we're not saying that you should, but if the decision goes that way, I think it's more important to look at what sort of commitments an MVNO beneficiary is willing to make into its facilities-based networks rather than how many customers they currently have before they can access it.
So in your view, it would be better if you're going to impose a restriction or a requirement that it be related to spectrum build-out requirements as opposed to subscriber levels?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to play the storybook backwards for like what happened with Irestel. If we had the same restrictions back when we were deploying our first CLEC network in Toronto and throughout the years, we wouldn't have been successful. The reason why we are successful is we were able to grab the customers because we had the freedom to operate within a regulatory framework and a platform that we developed, and then we're able to hit the threshold and we're able to expand and grow, and to put the investment back in wireless or spectrum facilities. Absolutely. I mean, that's naturally what we would want to do because it's going to lower our cost. Because even if we go with a phase 2 cost or a retail minus, it's still going to be more expensive than to just build our own network. And it's naturally exactly what happened with the wireline side. We were reselling a company before. We built our facilities because it didn't make sense after a certain threshold.
And you've indicated that you're not in favor of restrictions on resale. Others have suggested that it's important to have these resale restrictions so that MVNOs that wouldn't meet the eligibility criteria from a front door would enter through the back door under a resale model. Do you think that's a valid concern? And if not, why not?
No, it's definitely not a concern, and I'm sure JF has something to add, but the issue is you don't want to kill innovation. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, and I have customers that I know what they are capable of deploying on a network if they were to become an MVNO in Canada, and I would definitely favor that they run with it than me trying to stifle them and force a set of, trying to fit them in a round hole with a square peg or something. It just doesn't make sense, right? You want to nurture that child and give him all the oxygen and freedom he has in order to either become something or not, but that's his choice. But to stifle them at that layer would be stifling innovation. And Canada was at the forefront of telecom with Nortel, Teleglobe. We've lost all these companies. We've lost all these companies because we have a lot of rules and regulations that stifle this innovation, and it ends up coming from down south. There's no reason why we should be where we are today. We have brilliant minds.
Would you have any network security concerns with the resale model?
Network security is it's an end-to-end, right? I mean, a device could be hacked, right? And that's an iPhone or an Android, but it's also on the core network. I mean, on the core network, operators are typically running certain loads of software that are approved by the government of Canada in some cases, if it's a Huawei network or whatever it might be. So network security is something that we have to take care of. Otherwise, I mean, the operator would be has the most to lose on that.
So that would be within your control in terms of your resale agreement.
Absolutely.
You would ensure that the requirements are met.
And
in the case of a full MVNO regime, yes. I mean, if you're talking resale, just like branded resale, of course not. I mean, in that case, the MNO is in control of network security. But
Right.
I mean, if we're considering full mandated MVNO access, as I mentioned before, the MVNO is actually an operator and has its own billing system, its own provisioning, its own customer care, its own and its own network security. So from that standpoint.
And what are your views on an MVNO's access to both domestic and international roaming agreements of their host carrier?
Sorry, I just want to back up a little bit to your question about whether resale would have an impact on any conditions that are imposed. I think you have to look at why those conditions exist, and those conditions, if I understand correctly from the Commissioner of Competition's report, is you want to stimulate facilities-based investment. Whether those obligations are fulfilled by the MVNE, who is actually taking advantage of the regime, or one of his MVNO customers who is doing so who is getting his access on a non-regulated basis from the NVNE and a commercial rate, right? I think if kind of the first layer MVNO fulfills those requirements, you don't need the next one to fulfill those requirements. They'd be, it would stop at that level.
Fair enough. I understand your position. So then, I'm sorry, I started off with my next question, which had to do with what your thoughts were on, in this MVNO model, should there be access to domestic and international roaming agreements for the MVNO?
It should be a choice. I mean, I don't see some operators don't want to burden the headache with doing all the roaming arrangements with some of the hubs. Or I don't think that's. I mean, it would be detrimental if it wasn't offered because it would just delay these operators from being competitive. But I think it should be their choice.
And how do you see the wholesale rates being established? Should they be commercially negotiated rates backed by arbitration? Should they be more in the nature of a costing exercise with a markup?
Okay, so we've gone through this before, and we already all know that the incumbents are really experts at this game. So whether you want to call it retail minus, cost plus, they are going to reverse engineer it. And I'll give you an example. We were operating in Northwest territory, and we had the access to the broadband and the wholesale connect. Yeah, the wholesale connect. And we ended up with this tariff that looked great. You know, we're like, all right, this is, you know, half price or 1/10 the price at the time, I can't remember. But they put little caveats in there that we didn't really anticipate until we started operating the network. And I'll give you the example is, in order to basically get, you know, 100% of nothing, you have to buy, or sorry, in order to get 40% of nothing, you have to buy 100% of something. And what that means is, in order to get quality of service on 40% of your bandwidth, so if you wanted 40 megabits, or 40 megs of quality service to run like a VoIP network or a video that's real time, you would have to buy 100 megs of that service in order to fulfill your 40, because you couldn't go higher than a 40% SLA. The rest has to be best efforts. And as a small operator, we're not going to look at all these details. Like, it looked good, but that was when we started increasing. We're like, okay, we need better. They're like, oh no, you got to increase your pipe or to get the 40%. So whatever you want to call it, retail minus, we're definitely not for a retail minus approach. Definitely a wholesale, but a wholesale costing methodology that's retroactive, so that we're not stopped until the cost study is done and is controlled by the Commission, because to avoid these types of loopholes.
And in terms of control by the Commission, do you think that the Commission's existing final offer arbitration process is an option for resolving disputes in an?
We don't have experience using the final offer arbitration mechanism, so it's hard for us to comment on whether we think that would be effective or not. I'm a little leery because of our experience in when we do direct negotiation with some of the larger players. At the same time, I think I share Samer's concerns with regards to phase 2 costing. I think if phase 2 costing could maybe be, and I know it may be part of a future proceeding, but if it could be optimized or modernized so that it's, you know, quicker and more effective, that might be the best option. If not, then I guess we can't really say whether FOA would be better than phase 2 costing. And as Samer mentioned, I think we're pretty much against Retail Plus.
Okay, and I just have a couple more questions, and these are on roaming. Do you have voice over Lte roaming on your network?
No, we do not.
And do you have any plans to support that?
Actually, this leads to a very good point. I'm glad you brought it up, because one of the biggest challenges as a smaller operator is we're not able to get the handset providers to open up the VoLTE stack for us. And to me, so we are at a huge competitive disadvantage because if if Apple or Samsung do not support it, which are the main devices here in Canada, then we are always we have to basically double our costs in the network deployment, because we have to put a 3G network and an LTE network with a fallback, so that when you're on an LTE data connection and you make the call, you'll fall back to the 3G connection. We feel that this should go under the powers of the Commission, because just like a handset is an unlocked device now, and that's mandated, the software stack on the hardware component should also come with it. And as long as we adhere to what the stack requires, we're willing to work backwards with Apple or Samsung to allow us to fit into their ecosystem and not them having to waste hours to develop what we require. So that's a big impediment to what we are trying to do to serve Canadians, because that's a big deal. So to answer your question, no, we do not have VoLTE, and we do not have VoLTE on our home network currently because of these restrictions.
Okay. And what about the problem of dropped calls and seamless roaming? We heard from some parties last week that their customers experience dropped calls, and that it's a real problem for them in terms of their service levels to their customers?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a challenge, maybe not so much in our area, but I could see it becoming a challenge as we develop more in Quebec and Newfoundland. It also, you know, the incumbents complain about, you know, how MVNOs are going to decrease their revenues and their shareholder price and all that. I mean, this is a direct way to get more revenue from your competition in a way, right? There's so many ways that, so it is very important to do it, because at the end of the day, we're hurting the Canadian consumer, and that should not be allowed. Yes, there might be some technicalities, but you know what? Technology now, with all the stacks that we have, it's literally a few, I might oversimplify things, but it's literally, you know, you push a few buttons and it works. Yeah, so you might need a 2-week testing period. Great. It's not complicated anymore, right?
Have you tried to negotiate seamless roaming agreements with any of the national carriers?
No, actually, we haven't. And correct me if I'm wrong, have we? No, we have not. But we had bigger issues, I guess, to deal with, and that's why. But I think.
Yeah, so in our network environment, dealing specifically with ICE wireless, because the Arctic is very different sort of geographically than what you see in southern Canada. You know, the service is concentrated in the community. So where we have service, when the consumer would fall onto roaming as they're leaving the area, well, in certain communities, they can't unless they're in snowmobile because there's no roads out. In other communities in the Western Arctic, there's not a lot of coverage there anyways from the incumbent. Once you leave the community, you know, the communities are well covered, but once you get onto the roads, there's not much there. So the impact hasn't been very high. Certainly as we start building in Eastern Quebec, that impact will be much harder on us as, you know, people move in and out of our home network. You know, the calls will drop. So it's something that we definitely have an interest in, more in a forward-looking manner than what we've had to deal with in the Arctic to date.
And in terms of dropped calls, have you tracked those in terms of the number at all? Do you have any numbers for us on that?
We do have the stats, but it's not, once, because of JF's comment, is we operate in areas that typically when somebody leaves, like we have good coverage where we operate. So typically if somebody we look at it, if maybe there's a radio issue, but no, we have not really had. I think the challenge will become more and more so as we deploy in more connected areas where there's highways or roads. Yeah.
Got it. And I heard you in your presentation.
Sorry, I think in spite of the fact that a lot of our areas are island coverage or community coverage, like Jean-François was mentioning, the drop call rate that we track is under 2%.
Okay.
So it means that less than 98% of the time the call is completed within the coverage area.
Great, thank you. You indicated in your presentation that you had an issue with the wholesale roaming tariffs. If the Commission were to mandate seamless roaming, do you think that we'd have to make a change in the rates as well to accommodate that?
You're referencing the domestic roaming rates currently?
Yes.
Or, yeah, I mean, the domestic roaming rates are very high. I mean, I'll just put it in comparison. One of the incumbents offers service in Quebec at $2.50 a gig for specific plans. The same service provider outside of Quebec is $5. Same plan, same everything. So to go at, I believe the rate now is around $13 for per gig. We would need to see it right around the $2.50 rate in order to be able to innovate and build from that area. And obviously that could change. I mean, this is a static, you know, as of today, maybe 10, you know, a year from now will be completely different.
So in your view, before we even look at rates for seamless roaming, there should be an adjustment for the roaming rates as they exist right now?
Agreed, 100%, yes.
Okay.
I think that, and that sort of goes back to the issues we talked about, phase 2 costing and how, and I understand it's a very complex exercise and it's a very costly exercise for the incumbents to do the cost studies. But one of the issues that we have is that, you know, when the costing studies are submitted, they tend to stay in place and be relied upon for many years. And in a technology environment that we're in, things evolve very quickly. So you have potentially cost studies for services that are delivered, that were costed on equipment that's probably, you know, anything over 5 years is probably not in use anymore. With the wholesale rates, that's probably not the case, but nevertheless, the per gig price, as we've heard from many interveners in this proceeding, has been dropping steadily, but the tariff remains static. So, you know, I think that's going to be an issue going forward, because even if it's reset now, either you have to redo it on a regular basis, which imposes a very high burden both on the incumbents to produce cost studies and on the competitors to intervene if they disagree with the cost studies, because our cost consultants don't come cheap either. You know, there has to be some sort of mechanism, I think, looking forward, and like I said, probably the subject of another proceeding, to look at how these can be more evolutive, like they can evolve over time as opposed to just stay fixed for years or maybe even decades.
Great. And then I just want to...
Sorry, I would add that if you look at the CMR reports, the increase of RPU, year-over-year increase of RPU is in the range of 3%, and year-over-year increase of data consumption is in the range of 30% if you look at the recent years. So these tariffs, I mean, they need to erode, otherwise they become obsolete very rapidly under these circumstances.
Okay. And then I need to circle back on the area of the Competition Bureau model and suggestions about putting in investment requirements, that sort of thing. Do you think that the ISED build-out obligations in respect of the conditions of license for spectrum would be an appropriate way to measure investment?
Measure investment or to meet the criteria?
Well, as a criterion for an Mvno to build out.
No, I think you know, the 5-year build-out period and the percentages, they seem reasonable. I mean,
no, sorry. I was going to say, depending on the spectrum bands, the build requirements from ISED differ entirely from one spectrum band to the other. So, I mean, before this could be used as a measure or as a criteria, there would need to be some uniformity brought into the license conditions, because right now it's not the case.
Okay. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Barron.
Thank you. So we've heard the argument that prices in Canada are high because capital costs are high, and that therefore there is little room for prices to come down. When we look at your business model, your wireless business model, you seem to be building out infrastructure in some of the higher capital cost areas and some of the less dense areas in Canada. So given your business model, in a more competitive market, do you believe that there is, as you mentioned, a naturally dictated retail price point that is lower, that a small facilities-based provider like yourselves can offer that is economically sustainable? Or do you believe that retail prices are as low as they could go?
Definitely the prices can go down. And that's why we've introduced plans like the 99-cent plan, more to come as well. The idea is also, just to tie it into the whole Mvno discussion, is one of the highest costs in building a network or an MNO is not actually in the infrastructure and the towers. That's probably maybe 10–15% of what it takes. There's a lot of back-end support, you know, whether it's your customer service, your buildings, your interconnects, your maintenance facilities, all that stuff that takes a lot more So if let's say the floodgates opened up with MVNOs and I had 5 MVNOs on my wireless network, I'd be the happiest man because I don't have to support them. All I have to do is just focus on building the network, which is literally 10% now of the cost in a way, and I'm going to make a lot more margin without all the headache in a way. So that's why the argument of how the incumbents are seeing it to me is null and void, because I'm not seeing it. We're building it, and we're building it in some of the harshest environments in Canada.
So would you say that the capital costs and the operating costs of the business in wireless are very sensitive to innovation?
They depend on innovation. We wouldn't have to build a network if there wasn't a Netflix requirement in Iqaluit, right? We have to, that's what drives it. So is it a price sensitivity issue? No, because whether you have one customer on the network or 100,000, the incremental cost for that one customer versus the 100,000 is very little. So if you're going to do it, you're going to do it, and then hope that you have your 100,000, whichever way they come.
Thank you.
Commission Counsel, any further questions? No? Then I thank you very much for your submissions and your responses.